Hi everyone, welcome to the 8th lecture in the Shakespearean Studies. Today's lecture is about King Richard III, written by William Shakespeare. In this lecture, first of all, I will talk about the background to Richard III, and then I will analyze King Richard III for you. Let me begin by the background to the Richard III. Richard III belongs to a genre of Shakespeare plays known as the histories, which deals with events in England's historical past after the Norman conquest in 1066, although it is often viewed as a sequel to three of Shakespeare's earlier history plays, Henry IV, Henry VI, and Henry VII. Richard III is usually read and performed on its own. The play chronicles the bloody deeds and atrocity perpetrated by its central figure, the murderous and tyrannical King Richard III. Richard invites a spooky fascination, and generations of readers have found themselves seduced by his brilliance with words and his persuasive emotional manipulations, even as they repelled by his evil. History and family lines for a number of decades. In the late 15th century, England's royal family was locked in a power struggle that periodically erupted into violence. Historians have labeled this battle the Wars of the Roses, after the family symbols of the two contending groups, the Lancaster family, symbolized by a red rose, and the York family, symbolized by a white one. When the actions of Richard III begins, Edward IV and his brothers have overthrown the Lancastrians. But Edward is growing older and is often sick. His malicious and slightly deformed younger brother, Richard, is power hungry and is plotting to get his hands on the throne. However, a great many people stand between him and the kinship. For example, even when the King Edward himself dies, he will leave behind two sons who are in line for the throne. The young Prince Edward, the Crown Prince, and his brother, the young Duke of York. Fortunately for Richard's purposes, they are still children and they meet their final fate as the unfortunate princess in the tower. The mother of the princess is Queen Elizabeth of the Woodville family, and she has powerful and intelligent kinsmen who will try to protect her and her children, thus making the queen's kin yet another threat to Richard. The royal couple also has a daughter, young Elizabeth, who will later become an important counter in royal marriage negotiations. Let me begin by talking about the plot. After a long civil war between the royal family of York and the royal family of Lancaster, England enjoys a period of peace under King Edward IV and the victorious Yorks. But Edward's younger brother, Richard, resents Edward's power and the happiness of those around him. Malicious, power hungry, and bitter about his physical deformity, Richard begins to aspire secretly to the throne and decides to kill anyone he has to in order to become king. Richard III, using his intelligence and his skill of deception and political manipulation, Richard begins his campaign for the throne. He manipulates a noble woman, Lady Anne, into marrying him. Even though she knows that he murdered her first husband, he has his own older brother, Clarence, executed and shifts the burden of guilt onto his sick older brother, King Edward, in order to accelerate Edward's illness and death. After King Edward dies, Richard becomes Lord Protector of England, the figure in charge until the elder of Edward's two sons grows up. Next, Richard kills the court noblemen who are loyal to the princess, most notably Lord Hastings, the Lord Chamberlain of England. He then has boys relatives on their mother's sides, the powerful kinsmen of Edward's wife, Queen Elizabeth arrested and executed, with Elizabeth and the princess now unprotected. Richard has his political allies, particularly his right-hand man, Lord Buckingham, campaign to have Richard crowned king. Richard then imprisons the young princess in the Tower and, in his bloodiest move yet, sends hired murderers to kill both children. Richard III, by this time, Richard's reign of terror has caused the common people of England to fear and loathe him, and he has alienated nearly all the noblemen of the court, even the power-hungry Buckingham. When rumours begin to circulate about the challenger to the throne, who is gathering forces in France, noblemen flock in multitude to join his forces. The challenger is the Earl of Richmond, a descendant of a secondary arms of the Lancaster family, and England is ready to welcome him. Richard III, in the meantime, trying to consolidate his power, he has his wife, Queen Anne, murdered so that he can marry young Elizabeth, the daughter of the former Queen Elizabeth and the dead King Edward. Though young Elizabeth is his niece, the alliance would secure his claim to the throne. Nevertheless, Richard has begun to lose control of events, and Queen Elizabeth manages to forestall him. Meanwhile, she secretly promises to marry young Elizabeth to Richmond. Richard III, Richmond, finally invades England. The night before the battle that will decide everything, Richard has a terrible dream in which he ghosts all of the people he has murdered appear and curse him, telling him that he will die the next day. In the battle on the following morning, Richard is killed, and Richmond is crowned King Henry VII, promising new era of peace for England. The new king is betrothed to young Elizabeth in order to unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Let's analyze the play. A look at the background of Richard and how his upbringing and personal life contributed to his insecurities will help to understand why someone may become a tyrant. The comparison of Adolf Hitler to that of Richard, shown by the modern motion picture Richard III, will show the rapid rise and fall of the tyrant and the reality of totalitarian rule. Plato's Republic, a fascinating look at the comparison of the just soul and the unjust soul, allows one to see the philosophical motives behind tyrant rule. Oppressor rulers are simply driven by fear. Their anxiety and insecurities leads to hatred that has a desire to destroy, deep-rooted in violence. Dictator rulers are also never satisfied with the power they have at any given time, thus exposing their constant fear of retaliation from their subjects. This examination of a tyrant ruler by Plato clearly shows the motives by which dictator rulers rule, but it fails to explain why and how these motives originate in human mind. In order to comprehend why such a high level of fear and insecurity can be brought about, a look at the upbringing and personal life of a Richard should be brought into discussion. One of the three brothers, Richard, was in constant competition over who would succeed in gaining the throne of England. Richard, like his other brothers, wanted the title of a king quite badly, but as time pressed on, it seems less likely that Richard would succeed in gaining the throne. His shrewd attitude and a physical deformity that left him nearly paralyzed were two of the many reasons why Richard would be kept off the throne. Richard quickly became aware of this, and he therefore began his rampage to ensure himself the throne. After killing off his brothers and many others, who were eligible to succeed, Richard finally became a King of England. This title did not bring comfort, and Richard continued to kill anybody who posed a threat in keeping him from remaining king. Richard's reign as king lasted only 2 years, and during this 2 years period, Richard was never once happy, thus showing how the unjust soul will never be happy. His insecurities and fears worsened as he gained more and more power. This proves Plato's examinations of unjust soul or the tyrant ruler. To understand why he became this way, one must look at how his competitive nature was hindered by his mishappiness and how he could not come to understand his dispossession. It is clear that the motion picture Richard III aims to exhibit a parallel between the lives of Richard and Adolf Hitler. But why? The film aims to show a universal theme, the reality of a tyrant ruler. Richard ruled over England during 16th century, a time when totalitarian rule was quite prevalent. Hitler's rules, however, took place in the 20th century, which seems quite amazing, seeing how the ideas of liberty and justice had been accepted by most of Western countries. What is more amazing is that Hitler was unable to gain so much power without military intervention by other countries. By the time the Allies decided to take a stand, Hitler's empire had conquered many Eastern European lands and had occupation over France. Therefore, by a tyrant is something we must always be aware of. Though it is becoming harder to attain authoritarian rule because of organizations such as the United Nations, one must never close our eyes to the fact that man was given the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One also must never forget that government is meant to preserve these rights, not to take them away. We must learn from history, not forget about it. Assignment. Question 1. Conduct some research on real King Richard III and compare and contrast Shakespeare characters with the historical English king. Question 2. What is the role of women in the play? Do they have any power? If so, how does their power differ in degree and kind from the power of men? And that is how we come to the end of this short lecture. I'll talk to you next week. Bye for now.